The Senate Republicans, many of them seem to be eager for some reason to hand Joe Biden some sort of legislative victory. So Joe Biden is in serious trouble. His approval rating is in the 30s. He's just doing a terrible job. Well, last night, a bunch of Republican senators and some Democratic senators, they got together for a bipartisan gun control bill. They're trying to ram this thing through before anybody actually reads it. It had an 80-page bill, and it is very legalistic, right? It refers to a lot of other bills. So some bills are sort of self-encapsulated. This one is not. It changes old law. It kind of goes in and changes these. So in order to understand this provision, you have to read the old law and all the rest of it. This is the complaint of both Senators Marco Rubio and Mike Lee, who have said, hold up, you don't get to throw an 80-page bill at us and then ask us to vote on it 5 minutes later. We at least get to read the thing. Joe Biden has been pushing for something on gun control just so he can tell his constituents he did something on gun control. Here was Joe Biden reading his script yesterday.
Have you received a briefing on the guns legislation that senators say that they've gotten to a legislative text point?
A very brief briefing before I walked in the room to make sure I say, let them announce it, and then I'll speak to it.
Are you satisfied?
Let them announce it, and I'll speak to it.
You jack. Oh, well, they're now providing a service to that addled old fellow. According to the Wall Street Journal, the Senate began debate Tuesday on bipartisan legislation intended to curb gun violence in what would represent the first major federal change to gun laws in decades. Now, the reality is that the changes that are being proposed are not particularly major. They are not good. You know, the additional funding of red flag laws without any sort of specificity as to how those red flag laws are to be applied, that is not a great idea. The bill is apparently pretty vague, and it's unclear exactly how the black letter law will then be interpreted by states, how grants will be given, and all the rest. But it seems like this was just a do something moment. And this is what happens when you make policy on the back of emergency. Whenever there is something horrible that happens and this acts as a spur toward legislation, the legislation usually is crap. That tends to be the pattern in American life. The Patriot Act was wildly overbroad, and it was wildly overbroad because it was reaction to 9/11. Whenever there's some sort of major national catastrophe, and then legislators jump into the fray to solve the problem, very often they do more harm than good. The proposed legislation released earlier on Tuesday evening is the result of weeks of negotiations that started, of course, after the mass shootings at a supermarket, largely black, in Buffalo, New York, and at the elementary school in Uvalde, Texas. According to the Wall Street Journal, 10 Republicans signed on to the bill's framework released earlier this month. Senate leaders from both parties have endorsed it, raising the likelihood of passage in the 50-50 chamber. Now, I think that the logic here for Senator Mitch McConnell is take the gun control issue off the table for 2022. Right? The idea is if we pass something, then we will be able to say when Joe Biden says they wouldn't do anything, that they'll be able to say, well, actually, we signed on to a bipartisan piece of legislation with you on gun control. So what you're whining about? You're trying to castigate us as extreme. Well, we worked with you on this small piece of gun control legislation. I understand the logic of it. This is why McConnell is backing the bill. On the other hand, there's the argument to be made that handing Joe Biden any sort of legislative victory is a mistake. Because just from a political point of view, we'll get to the details of the bill in a second. From a political point of view, saying to Joe Biden, you can't get anything done. You have no ability to govern because you keep proposing things that people don't like. That is the other point of view here. And taking the wind out of the sails of your base, many of whom are very exercised by the possibility of passage of these sorts of broad federal mandates, that is a bad idea as well. The bill would set up a $750 million fund to help states put in place and enforce extreme protection orders known as red flag laws that allow firearms to be removed if a person is deemed dangerous to themselves or others. And again, I've said before that in principle, the idea of a red flag law, if you're talking about somebody who's exhibiting truly mentally dangerous behavior, like really dangerous, like going online and threatening people, okay, or somebody who's murdering small animals, right? Like somebody who's actually demonstrating full-scale threatening behavior, the idea of a red flag law is not bad. The problem is how it's enforced, because you've seen people on the left who have routinely said things like, if you disagree with me, I'm just going to try to take your guns away. And that, I think, rightly scares the living hell out of people, because one of the problems with an extreme protection order is that it is enforced without actually the ability to rebut right away. The police come and they take your guns before you actually have a chance to go in front of a judge and explain why the guns should not be taken. If passed, the bill would also close the so-called boyfriend loophole, which expands current law to prohibit dating partners or recent dating partners convicted of domestic violence from purchasing a firearm. Rights for those individuals will be restored after 5 years if they haven't been convicted of other violent crimes. Again, Senator Marco Rubio balked at the urgency. He tweeted, quote, "We're being asked to vote tonight to begin debate on a gun proposal whose legislative text was made available less than an hour ago." The legislation also sets up a grant program for states to expand mental health services for schools to increase safety measures. It would appropriate $1 billion for schools to expand mental health support, $300 million for school security and violence prevention programs. So again, that $300 million for school security and violence prevention, I'm fine with that. The red flag stuff seems like a bit of a red flag to me. The package also includes a crackdown on illegal sales of guns, would require an investigative period to review juvie and mental health records for 18 to 21-year-old gun purchasers. Now, I'm not sure if that law actually is sufficient because you actually have to now open up juvie records. Does the bill actually do that, or does it just provide an extra period in states that allow for that? The expanded background check for young buyers could involve a call to the local PD, take up to 10 days if there are areas of concern that authorities need to follow up on. The bill would also make it a federal crime to engage in straw purchases, the buying of a gun for someone else, or gun trafficking, which is the illegal trading of guns. Not sure how you would establish a straw purchase in a case, for example, where I buy a gun and then I give a gun to my 17-year-old son for his birthday. I live in a rural area. We want to go hunting together, so I give him a gun for his birthday. Is that now a straw purchase that is now going to make me a federal criminal? Well, John Cornyn is the top GOP negotiator and widely considered the heir apparent to Mitch McConnell. He says unless a person is convicted of a crime or is adjudicated mentally ill, their ability to purchase a firearm will not be impacted by this legislation. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi says that they are going to ram this thing through. The gun legislation is expected to cost several $1 billion. Lawmakers aren't insisting on waiting for a formal cost estimate to vote for it. Gun control advocates are backing the legislation. And they see this as the first step, obviously. The NRA opposes the legislation. They say it can be abused to restrict lawful gun purchases. But one thing that people on the right are saying, and I think is well-founded, is this is, as always, just the first, this is just a foot in the door. That the minute you start passing gun legislation on the basis of terrible things happening, well, next time a terrible thing happens, they'll push more gun legislation, and you will just pass that gun legislation as well. Apparently, Republicans wanted to include language banning the use of any federal spending in the bill for abortion. One person familiar with the talk said that had been resolved. No funding would be used for abortion. And again, final hurdles in the text, according to the Wall Street Journal, had centered on red flag laws known formally as extreme protection orders. Lawmakers had needed to work through differences on expanding federal law preventing people convicted of domestic violence from obtaining a firearm. Current law bans those who are married to, lived with, or have a child with the victim. So the boyfriend loophole is you don't have any of those things, but you have a girlfriend and you're beating her up, which, again, don't really have a problem with that. Not sure why it's a federal issue as opposed to a state issue, but all right. Now, is any of this really going to solve the broader problem of mass shootings in schools? Probably not, because as it turns out, the problem of mass shootings in schools very often tends to be derelict action by people who ought to know better, which is why, for example, we are now finding out that the Uvalde classroom door, where that supposedly the police refused to breach because it was locked, wasn't locked at all. Here's the director of Texas Department of Public Safety, Stephen McGraw, explaining.
There's compelling evidence that the law enforcement response to the attack at Robb Elementary was an abject failure and antithetical to everything we've learned over the last 2 decades since the Columbine massacre. The on-scene commander waited for a radio and rifles. Then he waited for shields. Then he waited for SWAT. Lastly, he waited for a key that was never needed.
It's unbelievable. According to the Wall Street Journal, McCraw said that police officers armed with rifles and protected by body armor were on the scene within 3 minutes. 3. Even had the door been secured, which it was not, they had the tools to break it open. They waited an hour and 14 minutes to go into the classroom despite hearing ongoing gunshots, knowing kids had been shot inside, knowing at least one teacher shot was still alive. Horrific. Horrific. No gun control issue is going to fix that. The failure of law enforcement at that level, at that scale, man, heads should roll. I mean, that is... there may be criminal negligence involved here. Just insane. According to McCraw, Arredondo arrived in the school 11:36. That's 3 minutes after the shooter began massacring the kids in the classroom. The timeline indicates that Arredondo repeatedly instructed other officers not to go into the classroom as he sought classroom keys and police protective equipment. McCraw said a teacher had previously reported the strike plate on the door jamb was broken and that the door was unable to lock correctly. He said he doesn't believe officers at the scene even tried the handle. Arredondo did not bring his police radio to the scene. It wouldn't matter because the police radios apparently don't work inside the building. He said testing after the shooting showed only that Border Patrol radios were functional. which shows that the local law enforcement didn't even have the ability to talk to people who are inside or outside. Just ridiculous. Ridiculous. 7 minutes after all of this, school district police officer Ruben Ruiz came into the school telling other officers that his wife, teacher Eva Morales, had called him and told him she was shot. Apparently, they then took his gun away to prevent him from going in. Just horrific failure of action by this police department, and no amount of additional funding to red flag laws is going to fix that. Again, this looks more like a political stunt by both Republicans and Democrats. Democrats say they got something done, Republicans to say that they helped out, than it does like an effective solution to any of this sort of stuff. Apparently, Senator Cornyn also pledged on Tuesday that he was going to negotiate some sort of deal on immigration. According to Igor Bobich, who is a reporter for Huffington Post, according to Bobich, he said, the vibe in the Senate is so positive right now, Schumer gave Susan Collins a fist bump. A smiling Cornyn tells Alex Padilla, the senator from California, first guns, now immigration, and Sinema said, that's right, we're going to do it. I mean, that is, I don't know what you guys do for a living. You don't have any agreements with Democrats on immigration. What exactly are you doing? So count on Republicans to try to pull Joe Biden's chestnuts out of the fire. Who's got two thumbs and wants you to like and subscribe?